This film is one in a series entitled Leaders of American Medicine, sponsored and produced by Alpha Omega Alpha, the National Honor Medical Society, the National Medical Audiovisual Center, and the National Library of Medicine. These programs were inspired and made possible by a generous benefaction from the late Professor David Siegel and his wife, Professor Beatrice Siegel. The leader in American medicine, who is the subject of our film today, is Henry Schwartz, Professor of Neurological Surgery at Washington University in St. Louis. He is interviewed by Professor Sidney Goldring of the same department in the same university.
Well, Dr. Schwartz, with a distinguished career such as yours, one would like to know how it all began. What was it that sparked your interest in medicine? What were the incidents? Who were the people?
It's very difficult to think back to those long ago days and to try to pinpoint any specific reasons for my entry into medicine. So far as I can recall, any familial influences were rather sparse. On one side there were some chemists and pharmacists. On the other side there was just one remote cousin who was in medicine. But it seemed very early on that I wanted some career in medicine. Exactly what it was to be is hard to tell at this juncture. When I entered college, my own background in science was not particularly remarkable or intense. I knew something of mathematics, a little bit of biology, very little in those days. And it wasn't until entry into college, I think, that I was fully determined to go on into medicine. This is as close as I can come to early influences, which for practical purposes, I suppose you might say, were non-existent. External influences. And I'm sure there must have been something. None of us is born, I don't believe, with that specific gene that tells us what we're going to do. I think to a great extent, environment, luck, good or bad, fortuitous events make us what we are.
Now, as I recall, he entered Princeton in 1924. I'm correct about
That's correct.
that. And there, I think you told me that you came under the influence of a biologist by the name of Carey.
Yes. At Princeton, in those days, they had introduced the comprehensive plan and departmental concentration program, which was in full flower, so that a student elected a department for his last 2 years and was to concentrate his energies in that department. There are pros and cons to that concept, but it did mean that you did develop certain skills, increase certain interests, and at the same time continued with other courses in other fields. We weren't as much concerned in those days, I don't think, maybe we were, with the achievement of high grades. I don't think the pressures were as great upon us to achieve grades, but we were all achievers. There's no question about that. We all tried. But there was nothing vicious about it, nothing all-consuming about it. As I recall very vividly, my best stroke of fortune occurred in my junior year at Princeton. I was pretty young when I entered Princeton, and I suppose it's easy for me to say that as young as I was, I fell under the influence of external things, good and bad. My first 2 years I did quite well academically. My third year I began to flounder for various reasons which I won't go into. But at that point I was taken aback by one of the then younger professors in the Department of Biology, a downeaster from Maine named Lewis Carey. He was not a brilliant scientist at all. He was overshadowed by people like Conklin and McClure and young Harvey, but he was a very forthright figure. I was assigned to him as my preceptor in the department. He pointed out to me that I'd better mend my ways or I'd never get through. And there was no doubt about it that through his influence I did mend my ways. And under his direction I undertook a small investigative project which really piqued my curiosity, which was a challenge. And thanks to him, I carried that project out with a good deal of credit, so that ultimately I graduated with honors in a department where I'd been suspect for a while. And my ties with Dr. Carey became fairly close. He was a distant sort of a man, spoke very little, typically Maine, yes and no type. But he made certain that I did my work. And I think I owe a great deal to that influence of that man. If it hadn't been for him, I'm not sure that I would have finished Princeton, and I'm not sure I might have gotten into medical school. But as it was, I had no problem about getting into medical school.
Well, now, he started you working on the earthworm, as I recall.
That's right. It was the lowliest creature, and whether that was my project because I was the lowliest individual in his group or not, I don't know. And I've often thought that might have been the reason. On the other hand, here was a creature which had the facility of regenerating itself. Just little pieces would regenerate. And it was intriguing to consider how their strange and fundamental nervous system could regenerate. How did this material grow back from what must have been pluripotential tissue? So that I guess that was my first experience with brain surgery, as a matter of fact. Removing the earthworm has two main cerebral ganglia, which lie on the dorsal surface of the head, and then they communicate with the chain of ganglia all the way down. And I became fairly adept at removing these ganglia and then watching them grow back. And this was the subject of my thesis at college, which was presented on one occasion to some people from the Rockefeller Institute who came down for an annual visit to the Department of Biology. But when I think back of my earliest brain operations, it was done on an earthworm. That's right.
Well, you've got to start at the beginning. But that work actually was picked up again when you were at Hopkins, and you came under the influence of another individual who had tremendous impact on your career. Mary Hines, I believe.
That's very true. And there again, I think this was represented a fortuitous set of circumstances. Hopkins was never known from its beginning, was never known for what might be looked upon as the deep personal interest on the part of the faculty for the student. Their attitude from the beginning was that of a graduate school where the student was there to learn. Didactic lectures were infrequent, and in many departments, very poorly given. Indeed, the Department of Anatomy at Hopkins under Franklin P. Mall was noted for the paucity of lectures because Mall didn't like to lecture, and yet it was a great department. Fortunately, in the dissecting rooms to which we were introduced with barely a word except that here is your cadaver, proceed with dissection, and the instructor then walked out, my dissecting mates were 3 other colleagues from Princeton, one of whom was a rather brash individual who was not hesitant at all in talking to anybody around, who, for one reason or another, informed Dr. Marion Hines, who was the professor of histology, microscopic anatomy, of the work that had been done at Princeton. And she came up to me and said she'd heard about this, and she'd like to talk about it. Well, we talked, and the next thing I knew, I was stimulated to carry on that work using much better, more sophisticated techniques than we'd had available at college. And that began an interest, continuing interest, in the nervous system, in anatomy, and in a devotion to a woman whose talents were just incredible. She was hard to know, as many of the students felt that she was very difficult to know, yet so far as I was concerned, she was my scientific mother, I suppose. Critical, demanding, but very supportive through all the difficulties that one goes through in any kind of experimental endeavor. And this relationship with Marion Hines continued all the way through medical school, and she helped me in many ways. She and her colleagues, whom I got to know fairly intimately, Sarah Tower, Kurt Richter, Howard Howe, Louis Flexner. These are all younger people in the Department of Anatomy whom I came to know very intimately, including George Wislocki.
Well, now, up until that time, the people who were stimulating, inspiring, were anatomists, biologists. At Hopkins in those days, there were a few other individuals of preeminence in the clinical area. What about the then professors of surgery and medicine and neurosurgery? Your contact with those people?
Well, there were great people there then, as there were before and have been since. The Halstead tradition was still viable despite the fact that the professor of surgery was a product of Rush, the product of anatomy rather than physiology, and the product of an entirely different school of surgery. But the tradition of Halstead was maintained through the residents. Early on, I recall, while I was in anatomy, when we were dissecting, occasionally there'd be a slack moment, and one or two of us would sneak away, go across the street to see what was going on in the hospital. Whether this was an urge on our part, subconscious urge to want to see what was the purpose of all this anatomy that we were doing, whether we wanted to see patients, I suppose it was an admixture of both. But I remember going to a very famous noon clinic which Dr. Dean Lewis, then professor of surgery, used to hold for the seniors, juniors and seniors, in which he would call upon any student who happened to be nodding or getting in his line of vision to come down before the entire group and be quizzed mercilessly, but very well, and never to be forgotten experience by any of them. And I remember in those early days when we should have been studying anatomy, we went over one day to Dr. Lewis's noon clinic. I sat in the back row, and he, in his inimitable way, then just pointed a finger, and it pointed to me, and he motioned, "Come down." Well, I came down, and he asked me to examine this patient who had some trouble with his hand and discuss the findings and point out what I saw. And I looked at this poor soul. I knew not what was wrong. This was in the early days before we'd even dissected the arm, much less the hand. He finally became impatient and said, "Well, what do you see?" I said, "Well, I think she has a sore thumb." With that, the entire class roared. He looked at me. I'm sure that he restrained his own amusement, because he was known to be a very severe individual, and said, "Is that all you can say about this?" I said, "Well, that's all I see." He said, "Son, what class are you in?" And I told him I was a first-year student. He said, "Don't you think you'd better get right back there to anatomy and learn something and then come on back to me?" Which I did. Subsequently, I interned on his service, and although he was never a very warm person, he also had a considerable impact. He knew anatomy backward and forward. He never forgot a thing that he read, and I've always been envious of that ability of his to have an elephantine memory in a less than elephantine body. And there were other individuals in those days who were extremely important in the life of a medical student. MacCallum in pathology was my good fortune to study under. Indeed, Dr. Welch was still alive, and later on as an intern I remember taking care of Dr. Welch before he died. And in MacCallum's course he stressed the humanities as well as organic problems, and as part of his course, before you could pass it, you had to write a paper on some subject, either pathologic or historical. He had a great interest in the history of medicine, and I remember my project, my paper, was on the history of hemiplegia. There again it seemed as if my interest was continually in the nervous system.
Now, as I recall, your contact with Dandy came later while you were interning. And prior to that time, I think there was a period during an elective and a summer vacation when you went to Germany, to Breslau, and spent some 8 or 9 months with Foerster. And I've heard you talk about that before, and that's apparently been a very significant part of your development.
That was, and that too, I think, was due to a fortuitous set of circumstances, going back, I suppose, to my initial contact with Marion Hines. During those early years when I was a student, Hopkins was looking for somebody to take over neurology. Neurology up to that time at Hopkins was somewhat of a stepchild, overshadowed by Adolf Meyer in psychiatry, who was a brilliant man but was not very favorably inclined toward organic neurology, and also overshadowed by the brilliance of Dandy, who was a surgeon, a neurosurgeon. There were a few neurologists like Frank Ford and Arthur Langworthy, both of whom I'd come to know. But Hopkins finally decided they ought to do something about the organic side of the nervous system. And in looking about for potential candidates, among the visitors was Foerster from Breslau, who was a distinguished neurologist and self-taught neurosurgeon, who came over as a visitor along subsequent, I think, to Gordon Holmes' visit to give a series of lectures. At Marion Hines' kind invitation, they had a little party for Foerster, what was called the Hamilton Street Club, made up of some of the nicer, younger people around the institution and in Baltimore. They gave a little party for Foerster, and there I was introduced to him. And I thought nothing further of it until Marion Hines, some weeks later, asked me whether I would like to spend a free quarter or a free half year with Foerster. And I said, well, that was all right with me. I didn't know how I would manage it. And she said, well, we'd have to get his permission first, but I've already gotten that for you. And then came the very practical problem. In those days, remember, this was still in the height of the Depression era. And the practical problem of how I was going to manage this financially. One of Dr. Hines's friends was Florence Sabin, one of the great women scientists of the time, who had been at Hopkins and who was then at the Rockefeller Institute. She had under her more or less control a scholarship given by the Denison Foundation. And she was interviewed by me, or I was interviewed by her, and I was awarded a Denison scholarship, which at that time paid $500. And with that $500, I was able to go to Europe and spent about 9 months in Germany with Foerster. And I might say that included the transportation over there and back, aided by an additional $100 Howell Award prize. But here one can see how a constellation of fortuitous events was responsible for that. It was a great experience to be there with Foerster. He was a tyrant, a perfectionist, very demanding of his people, but he couldn't have been nicer than he was to any foreigner who came to his clinic. He was a beast to his underlings, but foreigners were most welcome and treated most cordially. Even I, as an undergraduate student, was treated very fondly by him, and I still have fond memories of him. I helped him in his surgery. He was an atrocious surgeon, but that didn't make much difference. Most important, I helped him in one experimental project of his, dealing with the corpus striatum and the globus pallidus. And this was a good experience. Plus the nocturnal discussions. It was his custom to go into town, into one of the favorite wine stubas, and sit with one or two people and talk about neurology, neuroscience, history, or what was happening in the world intimately. And I was fortunately favored by being a foreigner to participate in many of those evenings with Foerster. It was rare that he had anybody to his home, though he had a very charming wife and two lovely daughters. But rarely was anybody invited to his home. It was usually a stag nocturnal visit to a Weinstube and over a glass of wine, just discussing the events of the day and of science at the time.
Well, now, after or during your internship, and as I understand it, Dr. Dandy actually invited you to stay on in surgery at Hopkins. But as I also understand, you still had some ambivalence about the future and what you really wanted to do. You were undecided whether it was anatomy or whether it was medicine. And I think that led to a stay in Boston at Harvard.
Well, all during my undergraduate years in the medical school, my contact with the Department of Anatomy remained close, always, on a personal as well as an academic basis. So that there was always this affection for anatomy and neuroanatomy. In those days, one was not too concerned about how you carried out your postgraduate training. Unfortunately, that is no longer true. In the present day era of competitiveness, the desire for absolute security for yourself, your wife and children. Of course, in those days, it was rare for any young man or woman to be married early on or to have children. Times have changed. But in those days, one felt perfectly free to go from here to there, picking out the areas that might be of interest, always being reasonably certain you could always get a job of one sort or another, going forward really all the time, without having everything plotted out year after year. And sometimes I wonder if those weren't happier periods in our civilization than we have today. Well, in any event, when during the latter part of my internship, I was intrigued, of course, by neurosurgery, by Dandy's tremendous skill, and he too was a very hard taskmaster. But as an instrument boy for him, for some reason he was favorably impressed, and things looked fairly promising if I'd wanted to stay on there. But it meant at that time that one would have to go through the entire period of anywhere from 8 to 9 years, going through all of general surgery in its various branches. In any event, I had also become fairly close friends with George Wislocki, who had been in the Department of Anatomy at Hopkins and subsequently went to Harvard as the head of the department there. And he invited me to come up there to spend a year doing some investigative work. And through his efforts, I got a National Research Council fellowship and went up there with the idea of spending 1 year. Well, 1 year became 2 years, but in the intervening summer I would go back to Hopkins and substituted in general surgery, still keeping one foot, I suppose, in both camps. The second year, I was appointed an instructor at Harvard and stayed on then for a third year. And it looked then as if anatomy was my love and future vocation. It still is my love, I suppose. And I don't know quite what happened during that third year, but I'd come in contact with some marvelous people at Harvard in the basic sciences as well as in the clinical sciences. And somehow a decision was made to go back and get some more surgery. I can't tell you how that occurred specifically.
Well, even though you were soul-searching and agitating about anatomy versus surgery, there was one love of which you had no doubt, as I recall, and it seems to me that that's during the Hopkins period is when you met Reedy. And
yeah, there's no doubt about that. But I'd said that it was very rare it was almost unheard of, A, for a student to be married, and B, at Hopkins, it was the rarest thing in the world for anybody going through a postgraduate residency program to be married. It occurred, but usually the professor's approval had to be obtained first. That's a far cry from what happens now. But there was in my class a very attractive, very bright young girl, and we became fast friends in medical school. We continued our friendship after medical school. She went to Cooperstown as an intern and then to New York at the Babies Hospital, while I stayed at Hopkins and then went up to Boston. Then we became really serious about things, and she finally landed a job in Boston at the Boston Floating Hospital under Dr. Joseph Pratt, who was one of Dr. Osler's residents and a brilliant individual. When she got that job in Boston, I had my job at Harvard. It was possible then for a young couple to make ends meet with the incomes, which amounted to, I think, about $3,000 a year between both of us. And we got married. And that was probably the most fortunate thing that ever happened to me. Again, fortuitous, but equally, even more so, fortunate. And it was from her that I subsequently realized how vital it was in the training of any young surgeon or anatomist or any other scientist to have a wife who could not only speak the same language, but more important, could understand and sympathize, worry, cheer you up when things were rough, and help you maintain your own sanity and a certain amount of equanimity. She has equanimity in tremendous amounts and has been a tremendous factor in everything that I've done. So I've said when I've been queried about selection of house staff later on, I've frequently said, well, really, I think we ought to interview the wife rather than the man.
Now, during those days in Boston, there was really a great deal of ferment in the neurosciences. A large number of people who, even then and certainly later on, made their mark in American medicine and in the nervous system in particular. And I think you came in contact with a good many of these people at that time.
Here again, I think the role of luck is tremendous. There I was in the Department of Anatomy with a former associate of Marion Hines, George Wislocki, who was a delightful person, who had married a hen med from Hopkins who was just a couple of years ahead of us, and with whom we were able to develop and maintain very close ties. Through him, in the anatomy department there, were people like David Rioch, who had also been a Hopkins product, Ellen Grafflin, and right across the courtyard were equally great, if not greater, individuals. In chemistry, there was Otto Folin, whom we got to know because our classmate at Hopkins happened to be his daughter, so we became close friends with him. Walter Cannon was the professor of physiology at Harvard, and he was a great man, of course. But in the Department of Physiology was a vital group of individuals. Hallowell Davis, Fred and Erna Gibbs. Between the Gibbses and the Davises, EEG in this country came into being. Then there was Arturo Rosenbluth, who was a very volatile Mexican, magnificent mathematician, basic scientist, physiologist, one of the great experts on the sympathetic nervous system, whose experimental work was intriguing and with whom we participated in various experimental projects. The interplay and interchange of ideas between anatomy and physiology, between anatomy, physiology, and the clinical scientists during lunch hour over across the street from the medical school, all of these were factors that couldn't help but have a tremendous impact on a youngster such as myself, who was impressionable and couldn't help but profit from this.
Now, from there you moved on to St. Louis, and the incident that led to your coming to St. Louis, I think, was a fortuitous meeting with Max Pete.
That's right. When I decided fairly late in my third year at Harvard, Department of Anatomy, to go back and get some more clinical work, by that time it was too late to get back into the Hopkins program. And I wasn't sure that I wanted it anyway, a long period. I still wasn't absolutely certain which way I should go. I wrote to Dr. Pete, whom I'd happened to meet when I was in Breslau, and asked him if he had any openings. And he said that he was all full, but a friend of his in St. Louis needed somebody as a fellow, Dr. Sachs. And the next thing I knew, I had an inquiry had apparently been made by Dr. Sachs of Dr. Cannon, who then asked Dr. Wislocki what was going on. And Dr. Kennan then talked with me, and next thing I knew, I was on my way to St. Louis to spend 1 year. That was the original idea. And then I was either going to go back to Harvard or back to Baltimore. But I found things so congenial, I suppose you might say, in St. Louis, even though, again, I came under the aegis of an extremely tough taskmaster, that what started out as a 1-year stay became a 40-odd year stay, except for the war.
Now, during those formative years in training in neurosurgery, there were others in the Washington University community and on the faculty there that, again, some were clinicians, some were in the basic sciences, but nevertheless had significant impact on the future. Tell us about some of those.
Well, that is true, and I might tangentially say, before I say anything more about it, is that these were the great advantages of all of these institutions with which I had come in contact in those formative years. None of these institutions were great, but none of them was very large, really. So that it was possible for intimate contact to develop between clinicians and pre-clinicians, between people in one branch of science, in say the preclinical subjects, and other people in other departments. This is something, unfortunately, that I think, as institutions, equally great, but as they have become large, we've lost that facility. And in St. Louis in those days, Washington University was a great institution, had many brilliant people there, but it was pretty small. And it was easy to get to know other individuals in other departments, on both sides of the street, the preclinical side and the clinical side. You ate together, you talked together, you drank together. Not that it was all a love feast by any means. I mean, competition was there, likes and dislikes were manifest, but nevertheless, it was relatively easy to get to know people and to exchange ideas. For example, my wife, when we went there, we knew very few people to start with, of course. Through the anatomy group at Harvard, I knew a few people. But my wife had got a job in physiology at first, with Lester White, and then went on and continued in pediatrics. Well, in St. Louis at that time, there were the neurosciences were, and they still are, I think, tremendous. There was Erlanger was there, George Bishop was there, Heinbecker was there. In anatomy, the great tradition of Ranson was continuing. In neuroanatomy, young James O'Leary was there. On the clinical side, Evetts Graham, of course, was an overwhelming figure in surgery. Dr. Sachs was a tremendous figure in neurosurgery. Villery Blair was the outstanding plastic surgeon in the world. These were individuals with whom one came in almost daily contact. The physiology department usually had what might be considered as weekly seminars. What these really consisted of was you'd take your own sandwich across the street and around a big table with a coffee pot that was always brewing. Once a week or so, people would gather. Erlanger, Bishop, Blair, Ed Blair, Lester White, O'Leary, Heinbecker. You just sit around, have your lunch, and talk about anything that came up, the experiment that you were doing that day. I met early on Philip Schaefer, who was the professor of biochemistry and the dean of the medical school, through our previous friendship with Professor Folene at Harvard, who was one of Schaefer's colleagues in the long ago days. And this led to a close friendship with Schaefer, who of course was then a senior person. The luckiest thing that happened to me in retrospect, in addition to being able to continue with neurosurgery, were my early contacts with people like George Bishop, Jim O'Leary, and Peter Heinbecker. Bishop was older than the rest of us. O'Leary and I were approximately the same age, maybe 3 or 4 years difference. Heinbecker was in between. And these contacts developed into very warm friendships with professional participation, experimentally, as well as personal involvement, which persisted over the years, and which, as far as I'm concerned, were probably represented the greatest, had the greatest effect in the success of any program in neurosurgery at Washington University. I would work with Bishop in my free time in his little laboratory with made up of wood, wire screen, and sealing wax, and homemade cathode ray oscilloscopes, a machine shop where we were taught by a tough German artisan how to make our own equipment. All of this was of tremendous value to me.
Now, the period of training at Washington University and at Barnes was, I think the period spanned between 1936 and 41, and at that time you joined of course the war was upon us, the Second World War, and you joined the 21st General Hospital and went into the service. And I think that was an important part of your career also.
Well, yes, it's been said by a very famous individual that war is the breeding ground for surgeons, going back to Larrey, Napoleon's time. And whether we like it or not, we have to admit that for surgeons, the experience gained in war, the treatment of wounds, treatment of infection, the basic things that one could learn about the physiology of the injured, the physiology of various organs. This is an experience which I think should not be overlooked. Not that I advocate war as a part of training. It's a disastrous situation. But nevertheless, the experiences gained in war can be put to good use. I was fortunate, I suppose, in the assignments which I had during the war to gain and to contribute something to knowledge of neurosurgery, the handling of wounds, of the head, the nerves, which became standard for our military services. There were trying periods when we went into Africa and all of our equipment had been sunk, so that one found it a little bit difficult to operate on penetrating wounds of the head without a cautery or without clips. But this too, I think, was contributed to one's growing up and ability to contend with certain problems. So that at the time, I know, I thought that this was the worst thing that could happen to any individual. But in retrospect, I'm glad I went through it and suffered through it, and I think profited by it. The lessons that we learned in the handling of wounds of the head, I think, were important. Up to that time, in the previous wars, the policy had been pretty much to leave the head wounds open, which meant the development of increasing infection, herniations of the brain, and a high mortality rate. We learned again, through a fortuitous set of circumstances, that these wounds, if you cleaned them up carefully, thoroughly, using precise, what Dr. Churchill called precise surgery, these could be closed and healed, and the mortality could be cut down tremendously. And these policies were then carried out in the subsequent wars that we've engaged in. Same thing held true with treatment of nerve injuries. In Africa, the policy became developed that we would just debride the nerve wounds, permit them to heal either by secondary intention or by a so-called delayed primary closure, and then go after the nerve about 3 or 4 weeks after the wound had healed. And this gave the better chance of recovery of function. And this too became policy.
Well, after the war, Dr. Graham called you back to St. Louis, and that was 1946, and you were made the professor and head of the Division of Neurological Surgery. And really started on a chapter in your life which I believe most of American medicine in this country believes where you've made one of your greatest contributions, and that is in training neurosurgeons both for the practice of neurosurgery, but most importantly to carry on as teachers and running their own programs. And I think the points of interest would be the events leading to your return to St. Louis and how you view this important period in your life.
Well, toward the end of the war, after I returned, in late 45, Dr. Graham apparently had heard that I was coming back. He indicated he had something to do with my returning from France then. Whether that was true or not, I don't know. Other people have made the same claim. But in any event, he knew, even before my wife knew that I was coming back, that I was returning. And I told her that as soon as I returned, he wanted to see me. And he then proposed that in considering the future development of the Department of Surgery and the school, that they were considering seriously appointing full-time heads of the various sections and departments, and would I be interested. Dr. Sachs was then approaching the retiring age, and after considerable thought, I agreed. In setting up, we have to remember that at that time, and up to that time, there was no formal type of training program in neurosurgery. There was nothing specific said about how many years you needed, how much time should be spent in this, that, or the other thing. It was catch as catch can, And when your preceptor or teacher said that you were ready, the then youthful American Board of Neurological Surgery gave you an examination. If you passed it, why, then you're a surgeon. All of us are influenced, of course, by what we ourselves went through, and I'm sure that this was the role that was playing in my setting up a training program such as it was at Washington University. It was my strong feeling that any individual, not only in neurosurgery, but in all of surgery and any of the surgical specialties, should have, as part of his equipment, some training and experience in basic science. And it mattered not whether this was pathology, physiology, chemistry, anatomy, or the more recent developing fields. I felt that in this way he would profit, not necessarily becoming a basic scientist himself, but the knowledge that he would gain would enable him to profit from his clinical experiences and also help him to push the frontiers back. On this basis, therefore, we early on developed a program which included a specific block period of time in basic science, either in our own laboratory or in the laboratory of a friend or a willing individual who was particularly skilled in one particular aspect of basic science. I suppose, in retrospect, one of the reasons for setting it up that way was the fact that when I was training then in neurosurgery and clinical neurosurgery, I took time during the course of a day to go up to Bishop's laboratory and work a little bit on experimental work, only to be interrupted by a telephone call either from the chief or from the ward that something had to be done of routine, more or less routine nature for a patient, and of course the patient came first. Therefore, I set up a program in which a block period of time, ranging from 1 to 2 years, would be devoted to laboratory work. And this would be in our own laboratory or in somebody else's laboratory, depending upon the individual's initiative. It was not to be a fixed program. I think that once you have a fixation of a program, tie it rigidly, making it conform, I think that this stifles initiative, it stifles change. And I'm pleased to say that the American Board of Neurological Surgery has always set out minimum requirements and not absolutely rigid requirements. And I think that this has been profitable. The thing that has been most gratifying, really, has been to feel that the influence any influence which I have had in the field of neurological surgery has been reflected in the development of young men who are now in charge of training programs, who have gone far beyond the abilities which I tried to inculcate and stimulate in them, and who in turn are being such productive individuals in the entire field.